I think if the future of blockchain and crypto is stablecoins, we've ultimately failed, right?
Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy podcast, where we ask your favorite builders the questions you wish you could ask yourself. This is a production of neonewstoday.com, and I'm your host, Dylan Grabowski. In this episode, we're joined by Alan Orwick, the CEO of Dominant Strategies, a development entity creating tooling and applications on the Quai Network. In this conversation, we discussed the broader stablecoin and pro-crypto movement in the US, why QUAI focuses on a volatility-reduced coin and not a stablecoin, the improvements QUAI has made on proof-of-work consensus, QUAI's dual token model, and the relationship between hash rate and the QUAI and QI tokens, and so much more. Just a reminder, nothing said on this podcast is a solicitation to buy or sell any tokens, and that the guest or hosts might hold tokens discussed in any given episode. You can check out a full disclaimer on www.neonewstoday.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review it on your favorite podcasting platform, and also share it with your friends and family. Every rating, review, like, and comment helps us reach more people and bring you more of your favorite guests. With all that said, I really enjoyed speaking with Alan, and I hope you enjoy the conversation too. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Smart Economy podcast. Today, we're joined by Alan Orwick, the CEO of Dominant Strategies, a development entity creating tooling and applications on Quai Network. How you doing today, Alan?
Doing well, Dylan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to jump into this conversation. I think maybe we could just get a little bit of your background and then at an overarching level, your perspective on stablecoins in general in the US and as an emerging vertical in the blockchain space. And then we can kind of hone in and wrap up on QUAI and all the cool things you guys are working on. So I love to start all of these conversations off with, what's your genesis story? When was the first time you heard about Bitcoin, Ethereum? Were you a broke college student and you said, that's not for me? Or did you get hooked immediately? Did it take a few years for you to fall down the rabbit hole? What's your story like?
So I actually was a broke college student, and I was in my senior year of high school, freshman year here at UT Austin. Our team is based out of the Austin area, so still very near and dear to my heart there. And I was always interested in programming, coding. So whenever I discovered crypto, I was like, you can do a lot of cool stuff with this. So between buying fake IDs and learning more about decentralization, that was kind of the initial spark, and was actually interested enough to go and start the undergraduate organization here at UT. So grew Texas Blockchain as the founding president of that. 200 students. We started some of the first coursework at UT. So a 1-hour course on blockchain and crypto, Bitcoin, and others. Had a lot of guests in from around the Austin area and people from out of state as well. And then eventually that led to doing a lot of the research and sort of more in-depth work around scaling blockchain technology and some of the things that ultimately led to QUAI. So it was pretty fun, a growing community around the Austin area. Went to a lot of the Bitcoin meetups and met a lot of the wizards and the cypherpunks and the people that were developing a lot of the code and tech. Austin has a very Bitcoin heavy scene. So definitely you get a lot of those, Bitcoin wildcatters and people that actually do a lot of the Bitcoin mining, and then people that do a lot of the development too. So a lot of great ethos there and people around that spirit. That was kind of my journey in, and have kind of been in and out of Bitcoin and blockchain since, and all of the other different pieces. I explore all sorts of ecosystems. I'm a, crypto native. So if there's a chain out, I love to experiment and try new tech, and definitely bring as much as we can back to QUAI.
Yeah, what was the vibe like in Austin and Texas, basically since the pandemic? Because that was when a lot of folks left New York, they left California, and with that comes the brain drain of like tech-oriented folks. And around those times as well, a lot of the coastal cities were really getting into like DeFi during DeFi summer, and you were starting to see just like a lot more of a surge in blockchain and Web3 and dApp development. So from your perspective, what was it like to have this influx of brand new blockchain minds while you were kind of going through your studies and onboarding into working in the space?
Yeah, Austin has always been pretty tech focused. They call it Silicon Hills, and there's always been a presence. We were talking on the podcast before how Apple's here, Samsung's here, IBM's here, and even since like the 80s, it's always been a pretty tech heavy city. So there was always a little bit of that lore and a little bit of that like allure of people coming and doing software here. And then I think COVID really accelerated that. So throughout my undergrad, so like 2016 to 2020, as I said, there were the Bitcoin meetups that were more like chill, local, like you go talk to anyone about Bitcoin. That was before like you had the, full explosion of L1s and L2s. So it was pretty focused on individual things. And I think nowadays those still go on and those still exist. And so there's a lot of companies that were focused on that. Like I think Consensus had some spin-off companies here, and there were different representatives from different ecosystems. I know Avalanche has a pretty heavy focus here as well. So there's always been that presence of crypto. And then we also kind of added on top of that, had the conference circuit here. So there was Consensus a few times, and then a few different iterations of other conferences. I know for Texas Blockchain, the club, we actually hosted a few conferences ourselves. And so we were kind of like the main conference for a year or two, which was pretty fun to organize as students. I was doing a few rounds. I had to serve my time in the Bitcoin costume. So there was a big Bitcoin costume that like had no fan inside of it. So you'd go and be like, all right, it's your turn to go do the Bitcoin costume. And you'd just go sweat for like 6 hours as you walk around the conference. So going again, back to your question on, post-COVID, it definitely accelerated it. And I think a lot of people being more at home kind of fit into with the remote vibe. And I think now the people that are, still around in crypto, kind of going again through this bear cycle, depending on what people decide to do, more activities kind of coming back around, and ideally, more actual like in-person and more facilitation around crypto can be sort of spurred by that sort of already good base that exists here.
Yeah, and would you say that during your time as a student, you were seeing like a continued interest in blockchain and Bitcoin and crypto? I only ask because I myself lived in the Bay Area from 2015 to 2018. And during that time, largely up until like the very end of the ICO boom, a lot of incumbent trad developers and development companies there would kind of roll their eyes when I would talk to them about crypto. And it was just so strange because now I hear like Silicon Valley is the Web3 hub of the West Coast and all this stuff. And that just wasn't my experience back in the mid 2010s. So did you see that as well, or am I just using a random subjective case?
No, I mean, it definitely grew and it dissipated pretty quickly. So whenever we started Texas Blockchain in the fall of 2017, that was sort of like peak ICO era. And so we were able to have like the room full of students and like room full of people. And like we had all sorts of guests, and it was great. And it was like just for those like 4 months. And then it just completely tanked. And then ETH went back down to like $80. And so at some point in like 2019, we go from like 150 people in a room, everyone's super excited about, to like 5 people in a room. And they're like, what is everyone here still here for? And I remember actually going to the Bay Area for a conference. It was one of the like main crypto conferences that was in SF, and Vitalik was talking, I want to say in like 2018, late 2018, and the founders of Avalanche were there as well. And it was still very much like very research focused, and like everyone was focused on the right thing, and the vibes were completely different. And then you kind of all got it rearing back again in 2021, and that was sort of post my time. So fortunately, a lot of the club was able to remain around, and there was those dedicated people that saw the vision and the things that we talked about. But it definitely sort of came and went. And we had a lot of great people that were, centered around that. Like Jimmy Song is a pretty big Bitcoiner. He would come to the club pretty often. Kyle Samani, pre-Solana days, was able to come because he's around the area as well. There were some Monero devs too. So definitely all sorts of different people in the mix.
Yeah, man, I look back on those events in 2018-19 fondly. Like ETH Denver 2019, when ETH was $80, the vibes were so high. And yeah, maybe you didn't have like 90% of the froth there, but the 10% of the people that stuck behind were true lifers. A couple of years ago, maybe about 3 years ago now, I had the opportunity to travel with the Neo ecosystem. Neo is probably a name you might recognize from the ICO days. We went to 10 different universities across the US, mostly the Midwest and the West Coast, and got to talk to a lot of blockchain clubs. And so as a result, I myself have tried to support students in the local blockchain clubs here at the universities in Colorado. And one of the things I've noticed is every 2 years you get this handoff. So there's a new wave of leadership. So I guess maybe what was like a lesson you learned about like succession planning? Or is there like a golden nugget that you can give to like current blockchain club leaders at universities for how they can plan to create like a more longer term outlook on their clubs?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging structurally anywhere, right? And as someone not only as a leader that's previously had that experience leading an organization, but also now leading a company, it's definitely tough just in terms of like documentation and communication. So it's like the basic stuff, right? It's like calendar, meeting notes, like structure, like do we have expectations across the organization? And then having those succession plans and like talking about it, because you have to find that, and then ensuring that you sort of keep people interested and have those events. So like one of the big things too with that is like, yeah, people care about crypto, but they also care about going out to the bars and drinking and having social events. So like if you can make it fun, if you can make it interesting, then those are the things that I think help with that whenever the time is right, and then also help just keep people involved.
Yeah. Are you still going back maybe like once a year to give a talk to the club?
Yeah, I'll be there on Friday. I'm doing a pitch competition with these guys. I'll be a judge. So that, and then of course, like, there's other organizations around Austin too, like ATX-DAO and sort of Texas Blockchain Council and all these other things that also are involved with the student group there. So getting those people involved and then trying to help students as much as possible. Because, those are the people that can create cool stuff. Like if they're done with finals and they got like 3 weeks to grind out a project and a startup, like those are the ones you want to help out.
Yeah. Shout out to Mason who left ATX-DAO recently to
Yeah.
work with crypto.
Yeah, I'll see him in May. So we headed up to DC there to spend some time with him. Well, I don't think he's in DC, but they're doing an event.
Well, he ended up in New York to do a lot of like DC stuff. Well, he's also just like traveling now, spreading the good word of Stand With Crypto, which has been a phenomenal organization. I got to fly out to DC in December 23 to espouse the virtues of pro-crypto legislation and regulations and things like that. So it really felt like they were fighting the good fight and we got to be a part of democracy. So yeah, also RIP to Consensus Austin. I was there the last 3 years, kind of bummed that we won't be there this year, but in that realm, we've seen a lot of regulatory and legislative headwinds pick up in the US. I'm sure being a builder here in the States, that feels good to see an administration talking about, 2 different types of legislations going through Congress right now for stablecoins and market structure bill, to see the SEC changing their outlook on crypto and blockchains in general, plus like overturning of SAB 121 and all these like really great narratives. But at the same time, like, the hopium that was going into the Trump presidency is kind of being sucked out of the room because of macro, basically, for what's going on. So I guess maybe with that picture painted, what are some of the reasons for hope that you have right now as a builder and a founder in the US? And maybe what are some other ways that we can temper our expectations and prepare for some choppy waters yet?
Yeah, so as we were just talking about, right? Like we've seen ETH at $80. Like we've been around when these cryptocurrencies for Bitcoin were like $400. And people around the industry have seen Bitcoin literally like below $1. So we know that it's a growing industry regardless of who is in the administration. And that's kind of the whole point of crypto is every 4 years we're going to get a new president, but you're not going to be able to change the code. You're not going to be able to change some of the laws or the structure that govern these blockchains. And that is by design, right? Or if they are, centralized enough to change, then over time, they'll become more decentralized. And so that is a growing trend regardless of what law is in place, whether it's SAB 121, the upcoming stablecoin bills, or just, Trump launching a meme coin on Solana. Like that is like all things that are useful and will continue to help ease adoption and traction and market share. But at the end of the day, you're not waiting on some government to go hit the green light and say crypto is a go. Only the builders in the ecosystem and the people that are creating this technology are the ones who can push utility and actually make sure that people use crypto every day, because at the end of the day, crypto is freedom technology. It is technology that allows us to operate outside of the state because they cannot control it. They cannot print Bitcoin. They cannot print Ethereum or, again, like spicy takes aside, like there's problems that we have to deal with as an industry, but the fundamental premise is we create these blockchains so that they cannot be tampered with. So I think the hope and the cause for a positive outlook is that we've spent this time to actually go and take a fundamental look at what we're doing, right? And cycle downturns allow for building. They allow for people to go and say, what assumptions did we get wrong? Which ones did we get right? If we look at things like pump fund, is that a positive? Is that a negative? That's some of the recent discourse that we've seen. If you look at polymarket as well, like are different types of bets good for that? Yes or no? And I remember, again, talking about Texas blockchain, talking about things like the Gnosis prediction markets and Augur and having those and saying, okay, like our assassination market's going to be a thing. And then it took like 5 years for that to actually sort of play out with the potential Trump assassination and how that went and factored into the sort of election there. So I think all of these things are being built on. And the hope is that, yes, like we want the ability to build in the United States. Like we want America, because I'm bullish America, I love America based out of the US. We want that to be a positive. I don't want to have to go to Dubai, right? I think I would hate living in Dubai. I'd much rather live in Austin. And for that reason, like we want things to get better because we want to keep people here from the perspective of the fact that crypto, I think, has the staying power. So we shouldn't isolate these people that are builders and ultimately want to help capitalism in that sense. So I think if you look again, like concretely, like we talked a bit about stablecoins. Stablecoins are going to be a $2 trillion industry that's going to be driven by institutional adoption. And that's going to continue to help with the facilitation and sort of blurring the lines between crypto and traditional finance. So the stablecoin legislation, Genius Act, and the stable bills are going to be really good for that. Again, it just kind of depends on some of the minutia of how you interpret the bills, but all good things. State-based legislation around strategic Bitcoin reserves, also good as well. Texas leading the way there, Wyoming and others. I believe Arizona is one of those as well. So all positive stuff there. And if we see those sort of winds of change, I think it sets up a pretty bullish landscape. It's just a matter of if we were to have, say, different people come in 4 years later, because it can change, right? You wouldn't want them to come and say, all right, well, now your strategic Bitcoin bill is gone and we're going to confiscate the Bitcoin, and all the things that you're hoping for in terms of the 15-year plan for Bitcoin is out the window. So I think we can't operate with continually having favorable presence in the administration.
Yeah, so for those listening now or in the future, the Standard Charter just came out with a call that said that stablecoins will be a $2 trillion asset class by the end of 2028. And indeed, we do have Texas, all these different states that you just mentioned, as well as the feds looking into a Bitcoin strategic reserve. So again, all these headwinds, but in the short term, how do you as a CEO of a company that's building out a blockchain ecosystem, how are you guys kind of battering down the ship or preparing the house for a hurricane, whatever you want to call it, for the short-term tumultuous kind of vibes that we're still feeling in the US and around the world, just as assets in general are getting hammered?
Yeah, I think the name of the game is survive, right? If you're an entrepreneur, you're building a startup in an industry that is a startup in and of itself. And so I think everyone looks at crypto and they're like, oh, it's just degenerate gambling. But how do you cut through all of that noise and actually create signal that there's utility here and there's reason? And so you have to look back on the fundamentals. You have to see, okay, why was Bitcoin created? What is the point of Bitcoin? What is the innovation of Ethereum? Why is Ethereum not doing well compared to Bitcoin? And these are real trade-offs in terms of users and eyes and mindshare and adoption. And then you can also look at something like Ripple and you could be like, well, Ripple is basically flipping Ethereum and FDV every couple of weeks now. What is causing Ripple to do that? And I won't say there's good or bad between an approach of Ethereum and Ripple, because Ethereum is way more cypherpunk and actually true to the ideals of what cryptocurrency is meant to do compared to something like Ripple. But at the end of the day, again, they're leveraging some of the benefits of the wins that you're talking about to go and capture market share there. So I think as an industry and as an entrepreneur in the space, we have to look and say, how do we want to market ourselves? How do we want to go and actually, help people understand what crypto is? I think a lot of it goes back to education. And so onboarding those next people that, and not when people in crypto say, the next billion users, it's well, we're not going to get to a billion if we don't get at least some people using these chains, understanding why they should be operating on a blockchain. And I think we have the base of people that are, willing to go take it up and market and help people actually use crypto every day. So from our side, it's definitely just helping people see that vision and see how we can actually use crypto and make the most use of it in our daily lives.
So the Genius Act is basically Senate's stablecoin bill, and the Stable Act is basically the House of Representatives stablecoin bill. And both of them are kind of moving through Congress on their own. How much are you paying attention to this right now? Is this something that you're keeping an eye on daily, or you're just waiting to see when we finally get some sort of stable genius conglomeration bill put together? What's the level of attention that this takes from you and your team right now as you pay attention to these larger scale political regulatory headwinds?
Yeah, if you look at those two bills in particular, right, they're addressing something that has historically been under a lot of scrutiny. So Tether itself has been looked at under a microscope because of its sort of prior concerns with reserves and how it's treated globally, as well as sanctions and it getting delisted in places like Europe because of MiCA. And then Circle has now sort of emerged with USDC as one of the more compliant forms of stablecoins. And so, between USDT and USDC, they're about 88% of the market share. That's some of the largest stablecoins by adoption. They also do the most flows. So I think daily volume of each of those is north of $400 billion. And USDC itself is surpassing ETH in terms of volume on the Ethereum chain, which again, I don't know how good that is. So from a regulatory perspective, I don't necessarily track it every step that it goes through and who's signing off on what, but I will see, the large updates and see that there is this pressure of stablecoins because it does actually reinforce the dollar. And if you look at the trade-off between the dollar and crypto, you have to recognize again that crypto in some sense was meant to disrupt the dollar. And so are we going to dollarize our blockchains? Are we going to give people that use the dollar every day means of using crypto, things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, more natively and sort of give them the tools, again, to tap into that censorship resistance, self-sovereignty, and more of those cypherpunk ideals. So stablecoins could either be a Trojan horse for TradFi into blockchain, or they can act sort of as reverse, in which we're actually bringing more crypto structure into TradFi, which again, that's sort of the balance and blend that we're at. Some of the concerns that I saw, very loosely between each of the bills is that they might limit who can actually go and create stablecoins. So are we isolating that to US companies, which again, if you're trying to export the dollar, may not necessarily be a good thing because right now, stablecoins are the 16th largest holder of US treasuries. So they're creating demand for the dollar. And if we were only able to say that companies in the US can create that demand, you're limiting that global adoption of the dollar, which again, as someone that is bullish on the US, well, that's negative because you'd want people all across the globe to get access to US treasuries. So I think those are the questions that are going to get ironed out. And those are the things that are, again, sort of outside of my area of expertise. I prefer to create, different structures and systems that would allow for, again, more cypherpunk ideals. And for us, we're focusing on different forms of stability, different types of access for stability on a blockchain and how that's utilized with what we're doing with the energy dollar and QI. So having something that's completely isolated from fiat in that sense.
Cool. And so I guess you did mention the BSR earlier. I'm just curious from both like a statewide adoption, there's 50 states, potentially 50 different BSRs, as well as a national scale Bitcoin strategic reserve. How did these BSRs create more opportunities for stablecoins?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at BSRs, so I think the state-by-state approach is the preferred one because then you actually get a little bit more competition. You can try to experiment on the state level, which one's best. Are you doing outright buying with tax dollars? Are you doing more of a donation-based approach? Are you doing something where you're sort of taking some of your outside revenue and converting that into Bitcoin or other types of cryptocurrency? And I think the sort of ominous like delta neutral or budget neutral buying from the US side is like not something that in the short term, I think has like appeased anybody because again, they're like, well, where are these budget neutral buys that we're talking about? So to go back to your question of like kind of what that does for stablecoins, I think again, that's getting people familiar with the idea of crypto because they're going to say, well, if my state is accepting Bitcoin, if they're holding Bitcoin, well, that might make it more comfortable for us to go use, a stablecoin for purchasing or might have a better mechanism of getting yield on stablecoins in a certain bank account or in a certain type of account that I'm familiar with. And so that type of access, I think, is beneficial. And I think if you can help legislate, some of the more structured products in terms of a Bitcoin reserve, then they're going to be able to also help quickly get things like stablecoins to consumers. And then you might also see state-by-state stablecoins, right? We're in the great state of Texas here, and so maybe we'll have some sort of oil-backed stablecoin that's created out of Texas with Texas oil. So those types of things I think could be positive and allow for different types of experimentation there.
Yeah, and so maybe this is an unfair question, but just because you're building in the stablecoin space, maybe you rub elbows with other stablecoin projects, but you did mention that Tether and Circle and kind of like the conglomerate of these fiat-backed stablecoins are the 16th largest purchasers of US debt instruments. So does that impact the way that the US government kind of recognizes these entities as valuable partners? Because now we're starting to talk about like sovereign state level purchases of US debt instruments. So from your perspective and your opinion working on a full-time stablecoin project in the blockchain space, do you believe that this is showing the US government is starting to take the stablecoin industry seriously because they are buying more debt instruments than the majority of countries out there?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to, right? Like these are people that are going to directly influence the next generation of payments and commerce. And so when you look at things like World Liberty Financial, well, Justin Sun is an investor in that. And so they're going and they're facilitating also the new launch of a stablecoin there. So they're making their own form to go compete with USDC and USDT. So that type of influence is real. And I think when you look at just the people that are playing this game, that they're very interested in finding ways to ensure the long-term success of the dollar and then also how to make these stablecoins real and practical for everyday Americans and people across the globe, because that is the cheapest way to send money. It's still, pretty expensive if you look at transacting on some of these blockchains. A stablecoin transfer on Ethereum can still be $12 if you're sending USDC. And then on systems like Tron, speaking of Justin Sun, can still be, $3 to $5. So how do we solve those challenges if we're still actually trying to compete with stablecoins against systems like Visa and MasterCard? I don't think we've cracked that nut yet, which again goes back to something that is closer to what we're solving. But again, I think the questions are there of how do we make these systems seamless, easy to use. And I think that over time, the US government will try to find ways to sort of crack down on this. And I do think, we're positioned better than a system like China with CBDCs or sort of, flashback 3 to 5 years ago, whenever the concern around stablecoins actually was more around CBDCs. So are we going to have limits, and are we going to be censored? If I'm speaking negatively about a politician, are they going to ban my account or my wallet? Are they going to flag me? So I do think there is a little bit more opportunity there in the stablecoin space if we do have the commoditized approach with stablecoins and different issuers that I choose to use. And then also some of the benefits in terms of the legislation that we talked about earlier, when you look at things like Tornado Cash now getting taken off OFAC sanctions list, like that's huge. And so factoring that into like what they're trying to do, I think their intentions are positive. I do think there are negatives sort of in the step-by-step approach, and I think all of it will be worked out. But yeah, ultimately, it is going to be something that does promote dollar dominance and then also the export of the dollar with the growth of stablecoins.
Yeah, so stablecoins are crypto's killer use case. I mean, if you go back the past 2, maybe even 3 years, the number one transaction that's happened on chain has usually involved a stablecoin of some sort. And the even dirtier secret was 2022, 2023, maybe even 2024. A lot of this activity was happening on Tron, though Tron is seeing kind of historic fees right now. So it is becoming more and more expensive. But as we talk about stablecoins as an industry, if you go onto like rwa.xyz's dashboard, you can probably see 40 different issuers, but the overwhelming majority are Tether and then Circle. So do you think that Tether is apt to lose its market position because its number one kind of like competitor right now is USDC? And as we can see in the filings that they put for their IPO, they're not necessarily a super profitable company and maybe even like not that sexy for a traditional investor to get into. So maybe this is me like lobbing you a softball. Is there an opportunity right now to get into the stablecoin market, to compete, to take market share away from Tether? Is Circle like the secondary incumbent that is guaranteed to be number 2? What are the opportunities that are available right now for stablecoin creators in the space?
Yeah, I think if the future of blockchain and crypto is stablecoins, we've ultimately failed, right? Like we've gone and created all these systems and we've done this coordination of people to go and just create TradFi. So ultimately, yeah, Tether needs to be disrupted, USDC needs to be disrupted, and the dollar needs to be disrupted. And what we're doing with QUAI and how we've built the energy dollar is that exact approach. We've created a system that has low fees, can scale 50,000 plus transactions per second, and then you can again get that Visa MasterCard-like experience with something that is not tied to a dollar. It's tied to energy, and that is done through proof-of-work mining. So creating a medium of exchange in a new form of medium of exchange with something that actually looks like cash with a unit of account, so a basis in energy, which in our opinion, and from what we've seen in different types of monetary designs, is actually a better source of stability and economy and from a commerce standpoint. And we've sort of looked at how we've always had monetary systems tied around energy because we started with gold, silver, we had physical goods that we based, whether they were seashells or all sorts of different types of mechanisms, going all the way back to stones on an island, I think is like the classic example when people talk about monetary systems in that way with Bitcoin. And so, the Bretton Woods was sort of that main sort of agreement that established the US as the hegemonic power that allowed us to export the dollar. And then we ultimately took everyone off the gold standard whenever we said, we're just going to have fiat now. So now we live in this world of fiat, and the US dollar has sort of been that primary driver of growth. And we're starting to see some cracks in that. And if we say we're going to reinforce that with stablecoins and our blockchain systems are purely going to be facilitating US dollars, well, that's taking away a lot of the benefit of these, again, key breakthroughs of creating monetary systems and designs. And so you say, blockchain's number one killer use case is stablecoins. I disagree. I think the killer use case is money. And if we can actually find a way to make a better monetary system, then I think we will find ways to, again, align humanity towards a more prosperous future and create something that even Satoshi Nakamoto said whenever he was creating Bitcoin could change people from fighting wars to accomplish power to instead use economic power and use energy and use sources of soft force to achieve peace that way. And so from my eyes, I think that's sort of the key breakthrough there with blockchain. With QUAI, we're trying to build a new monetary system around energy that allows us to actually fulfill some of that vision. And stablecoins are part of that in the short term. I think they're more of an off-ramp into this future in which you have different monetary systems sort of competing outside of the state. And yeah, I think ultimately that would be like the libertarian sort of focus of where things are headed. And it's going to take a while to get there. Even with Bitcoin at like 85K now and a peak of 106, like that's still like light years away from like where we were, but I still think there's a long way to go. And ultimately, we still want to see a rising tide lift all boats, and we want crypto to succeed as a whole. So I think it's enough grave dancing, even on systems like Ethereum, even if it's been down only since Bitcoin, since the merge. But I think there's a ton of room for experimentation. Yes, stablecoins will be useful, but at the end of the day, there's got to be more.
I appreciate the positive outlook. I generally get concerned when I think of Bitcoin as the global monetary standard, that we've devolved into some really kind of dystopian world where all fiat currencies are wiped away and we're dealing in commodities of Bitcoin, beans, and bullets to survive and really have value. So I appreciate the reason for hope there. I also want to take like a step sideways so we can really slingshot us forward. As we're talking about adopting cryptocurrencies and stablecoins more broadly across different networks, and as you're mentioning, you have this thesis for why a power-backed network is a really solid kind of like economic model to be based off of, we're still kind of in this weird position where ETH is down only, but of the $227 billion of stablecoins, 127 billion live on ETH, 67 billion live on Tron. The overwhelming majority live on these proof-of-stake networks. So what gives? Why are stablecoins on Ethereum? Why are they on Tron? Why are people dunking on Ethereum when there's this really like major use case of RWA activity on it? And then kind of like using that, maybe we can slingshot into the work that you're doing, and maybe we could even talk about the stablecoin report that you released recently, overviewing the 5 categories of stablecoin.
So yeah, I mean, I think, as someone that's loved Ethereum since the beginning, right? Like it's definitely the platform did have the most builders. And I still think it, as you said, it does have the most stablecoin activity and the most RWA activity. And that is because it has accomplished its goal of being a decentralized, credibly neutral layer. And that has, again, been the key thesis of crypto. And so put aside the ultrasound money narrative, put aside, a lot of the fix the money, fix the world, put aside, a lot of the world computer narratives. I think if we were to optimize for speed, you'd eventually, again, end up in Web 2. And so in crypto, you first have to optimize for decentralization, and you have to do it as soon as you can, as early as possible, or else most of that will trend towards centralization. And if you do trend towards centralization, you always end up with the question, why not just use a database? Like, why don't you just put all of these people just on one AWS server? And I think Ethereum right now has accomplished its goal. And it's starting to get to the point of ossification in which it is hard to coordinate upgrades. It is hard to coordinate scaling the L1 and scaling the base layer. So they have had to push off to layer 2s, and that is by design. Although if you look at using Ethereum, the L1, as that source of sort of liquidity and decentralization, if you ask any institutional fund, right, look at BlackRock with the Build Fund, they're going to want to put the bulk of their money on Ethereum because they know that is where it's going to be the most economically sound. And so for me, I think that is where you look at some of that TVL, the DeFi activity, having that as the piggy bank there for people to use Ethereum in that way and as a hub, I think is going to help sort of with that long-term use case. I'm not a macro expert. I'm not a trader. I'm a builder. And it's unfortunate to see sort of what's happened with Ethereum's price action in that regard. But I think that if you were to sort of look at the long-term outlook, that is, in my opinion, way more valuable to have that hub and have that source there for people to tap into than all of the fragmentation on the end where experimentation occurs.
Would you say that stablecoins living on Ethereum and surviving, and Ethereum as a network, I'm not even talking about as an asset, like surviving and actually becoming a stronger network in the future and more adopted by these institutions, is that a tide that lifts all boats? Does QUAI get to benefit from Ethereum's success of institutions onboarding into that ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I would say yes, obviously. Like we want Ethereum, the network, to do well, and we want people to find ways to put more liquidity into blockchain systems with stablecoins. Although I think if that remains isolated, it wouldn't benefit us, right? If it's just all activity occurring on Ethereum, of course, QUAI wouldn't benefit in the same way that Bitcoin wouldn't benefit. And so from that regard, it would be, how do you leverage the bridges, the connections, the ability for people to go and move funds in a permissionless manner that would allow that to occur? Because, from our side, the last thing that I would want to see Ethereum end up being is purely just a KYC layer in which you have to KYC to use the network, and there's a trusted source of node runners, and there's certain requirements that it takes, and that people kind of at the end of the day end up again looking like Web 2 and TradFi.
Yeah, so I'll just go ahead and paint what I see. A lot of these stablecoins are landing on Ethereum right now. A lot of RWAs are landing on Ethereum because it's the oldest battle-tested blockchain network with no downtime. And this is the first thing outside of Bitcoin that these large-scale players are playing with. And as they continue to progress through the industry and progress through the tech stack and using blockchain, then they will start exploring other blockchain networks. So enter QUAI. What is the kind of value prop that QUAI is bringing? And why did you and your team opt to go for a power-backed sort of narrative, a power-backed stablecoin? And maybe you can also go through the stablecoin report that was recently released that had 5 categories. I want to say of stablecoins, but this kind of looks like 5 categories of like, what is the thesis behind QI? So let's like go there. After Ethereum, these TradFi guys, these large-scale institutions are looking at building on other networks. How is QUAI positioning itself to gain market share for QI?
Yeah, absolutely. And so like I said earlier, if we continue to go down the route of stablecoins that we're currently on, then we will likely create the Achilles heel of crypto. And so something that can be censored, something that can be controlled, something that is essentially issued. And of course, the commoditization of stablecoins helps because you can sort of pick and choose. But ultimately, a blockchain doesn't understand what a stablecoin is. It doesn't understand what a dollar is because there is no way for a computer to understand fundamentally from a physics perspective what that means. There is just no physical tie. And so when you talk about sort of a network that's powered by energy or powered by sort of electricity and something that can tap into that source of physical stability, that's the real world tie, we're actually creating a token that's not necessarily a stable coin, but is actually closer to a low volatility coin because it emits the rewards proportionally to hash rate, since QUAI is a proof of work network. And again, there's differences between proof of work, proof and stake. I won't get into much of the nuance because most people prefer proof of stake if you're aligned with Ethereum, and that totally makes sense. But the key kind of breakthrough is that we've actually found a meaningful use of proof of work, and we found a way in which that we're not just wasting the energy. We're making some economic use of it outside of, say, for Bitcoin, the emissions of Bitcoin with the every 4-year halvings make no use of the energy that it uses. It just uses it primarily for economic finality and security versus the actual economics of the network and the token economics. So what we're doing with QI in this way is we can say, well, how do we create this new form of stablecoin adjacent flat coin and tie it to energy such that we can have this crypto native form that actually looks like cash? Because we can see that if you were to say, have a bunch of Bitcoin and Ethereum, most oftentimes you don't want to spend it. You'd rather hoard it. And you would say, well, why am I going to spend my Bitcoin if I'm going to go buy a cup of coffee whenever it could be worth 3 times its amount in the future? And so for that, you'd say, I'd rather spend my dirty fiat that I earn. And so if you go and say, well, what if we created a crypto system that actually looked like cash and that had some relative sort of source of stability against the world in which we know it? Energy is actually a good proxy for that. And energy prices have actually remained pretty steady, the past 25 years if you compare it against the Canadian dollar, the US dollar, the euro, the yen, and others. And if you look at sort of the Forex markets in that way, energy is a good source of that. And our supply chain is also dictated by energy because if oil prices go up, well, oftentimes the price of goods go up and groceries go up and others. And so, of course, it's not one specific energy source, so oil or hydroelectric or solar or nuclear or others. It's a blend because proof of work mining is the process of finding that lowest energy source in terms of pricing and exploiting that to mine cryptocurrency. And so if you look at that same incentive with Bitcoin miners, they'll go off into the middle of West Texas, they'll mine Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin is sort of isolated in terms of mining from, say, downtown Austin. And so when that occurs, well, then they have Bitcoin and they can send it anywhere across the globe, and that's separate in terms of the connectivity against the grid. And so that's a process that encourages not only the lowest cost of energy, but it also encourages renewable forms of energy because most often those are actually the ones that are cheapest to use. And so for QUAI, again, tying that back to the stablecoins there, we'd see, well, how can we actually go and remove this Achilles heel for crypto? How can we go and, again, bring back these cypherpunk ideas and see ways in which we can create monetary systems that can leverage the decentralization of crypto, leverage censorship resistance, leverage sovereignty, self-custody in ways in which we can actually transact with it. So from our side, it'd be how do we keep these fees low so that I can actually go spend it without worrying about that same fee that we talked about earlier? How can we make people adopt it? So what do we actually need to do to make merchants adopt it? What sort of systems and what sort of processes do we need in place? What ways do we actually enable people to create these wallets? And that's one of the beautiful things about crypto as well, is I don't need 3 months of income to go and set up a crypto wallet. I just get an internet connection and I create it, or even sometimes a satellite connection. Like, it should be that easy. And so those are all the questions that we're asking in this journey of actually creating QUAI, creating QI, building this blockchain, going down this entire rabbit hole of what it takes. And it's been a beautiful thing to learn and sort of get to this point of where it's at today.
So I hope I'm not throwing a fastball too much, but I'm just going to play devil's advocate. So you go onto like gaming subreddits and these guys hate crypto. They hate blockchain because it's destroying the planet. That is directly tied to the proof of work narrative. So are you giving your marketing team a doubly hard challenge by going out there and espousing the benefits of what QUAI and QI are?
Oh, they do hate it. Gamers hate proof of work mining. I mean, in the same way that people driving to their bank to go deposit a check are burning all sorts of fossil fuels, and the people sitting in the bank and the traditional finance sector are all causing all of this. In comparison, crypto is such a small blip on the radar. And they've said for Bitcoin in specific, it was going to burn all the ice caps by 2025. That was one of the key reasons Ethereum actually shifted to proof of stake, as they had concerns with proof of work mining. And all of those fears have just been vastly overstated. And if anything, what we're seeing is that proof of work mining is actually carbon negative due to the fact that you can go and do things like trapped landfill gas mitigation, tarping methane that's emitted off of landfills and then piping that into a generator and making that into CO2 and making it anywhere between 75 to 80% less potent to the atmosphere than if it was methane. And so things like that, the flare off of oil wells as well, is one of those things that helps with carbon negative sources for mining and energy capture. And as I shared, the cheapest sources of energy are actually the renewable ones. If you have a dam out in the middle of Alberta, Canada, and it's generating a bunch of hydroelectric, but there's not a city near it to actually go and capture that electricity, well, you're going to mine crypto. So the incentive is there. And I don't think it's the equivalent as, lighting a bunch of trees on fire to go and mine crypto. It's done in a very resourceful way, and it has to be because it's a competitive game. And the economics and the margins are just, way too small for any mistake. And so you actually see that in response with Bitcoin prices and hash rate. And you see that even on QUAI. We're a small network, but if the price goes up, the hash rate goes up. Price goes down, the hash rate goes down. And these people are very sophisticated. And so no one anywhere is just going to be lighting money on fire. They're going to make very rational choices around that energy spend. And that rational choice is because of how efficient it is in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, Colorado has a lot of fracking that goes on here. So we're starting to see companies cap these natural gas extraction sites so that they can capture methane and indeed use that to power a GPU for mining. When you look at like ERCOT and the energy grid, like Bitcoin miners have worked in a symbiotic relationship. During times of peak power, the miners will reduce their consumption. And during times of underused power, the miners will step in and use that electricity, because a lot of folks don't realize that at the source where energy is created, as it travels further away on the wire network, we lose that electricity and that energy. So there is a valuable service that proof of work miners are providing. It's a really hard narrative to get over. It's kind of like when you're having a conversation with someone who is very one-sided in terms of their political beliefs. It's not a conversation. It's just two sides yelling at each other, and there's no getting through to the other person's mind. So I just am curious if you guys are running into this issue with this kind of negative overarching narrative.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you see that, right? And as I said, it's overblown, it's overstated. If I had to, say one thing to those people, it'd be, if you made a Studio Ghibli image with ChatGPT, you shouldn't have any problems with proof of work. So if you're on that trend, you don't get to talk about it.
Oh, I made so many of those images, but I also I never complain. I know full well that I'm a hypocrite. So I want to know a little bit more about the relationship between the QUAI token and the QI token. Why did you guys adopt a dual token model? I've been in an ecosystem for a long time that has a dual token model, so I can see the benefits. Why did you choose to deploy this in 2024, 2025?
Great question. So again, I'll reframe the conversation around just some of the principles that we talked about earlier. And so creating a monetary system and having something that can actually go compete with kind of all-in-one use of money there is the key breakthrough of crypto. And we've seen Bitcoin really accomplish the store of value side. So what are the three things that exist in a monetary system? Well, you need a store of value, you need a medium of exchange, and you need a unit of account. And so right now, if you were to sort of be a day-to-day user of crypto, you'd store your value in Bitcoin, and then you would use the cash and fiat as your medium of exchange, and your unit of account would sort of be the Fed and the government and kind of telling you what this value is. And so from our side, we've said, well, how do we actually put this all into a blockchain so that you have these properties? And so you're able to accomplish that with two tokens. And two tokens are useful because it actually applies some to Gresham's law, in which Gresham's law states that bad money drives good money out of circulation. And so good money being something that you want to hoard and bad money being something that you actually want to spend, get rid of. Again, dirty fiat, like I talked about. One of the reasons why the Roman Empire collapsed is because their gold was getting devalued, defaced. So bad coins were put into circulation. And so all of that is, from our side, how do you create bad money in these systems? Bad money in these systems today are stablecoins. But again, we already just talked about all of those problems with stablecoins. And so the way in which we've accomplished those three key properties is we have QUAI as that store of value-like asset. We have QI as a medium of exchange that you can spend that has cash-like privacy and a way in which that is transferable very easily with low fees. And then that unit of account in the system is energy. And so having that energy as a basis of pricing and having that as a mechanism of tying it to goods and services that you use in day-to-day life. And so we've sort of taken these three sort of properties, put them all into one network and have launched that. And we've spent many years, it's been 7 years in the making to sort of get all of those pieces together, and a lot of research and design around those principles and what it means to actually accomplish that with a blockchain. But from our side, that is the approach of why we need those two tokens and how they're spent. And of course, those are transferable across each other. They're both mined as well. So you can mine either QUAI or QI. The mining of QUAI and QI as block rewards is what creates that shelling point that helps tie that price of QI to energy. And again, QI is not perfectly stable. It's not like $1. If you look at other algorithmic coins or coins in which that attempt to create the source of stability, what they do is they actually price it to $1. And again, that runs into problems because, as I said, blockchains can't understand what $1 is. But a blockchain that is proof of work natively does understand what energy is through the innovation of the difficulty controller. So from our side, that's like the physics-defined first principles approach of why you need to.
So you said that QI isn't a stable coin, it's a low volatility coin. So what's the relationship? Is there like a particular algorithm that states you're going to reduce the kind of changes in energy consumption and that is going to be overlaid on QI, and then the excess is going to go into the volatility of the QUAI token?
Yep. And so that mechanism is the difficulty controller, the hash rate. So every time you give the network one hash, it gives you one QI. And you can make that decision if you want QUAI or QI. And that design, again, is what puts QI into the marketplace or into the market at the price of hash. Because if QI is not demand, if there's no demand for QI, then people will mine QUAI. And so with that, every time QI is mined, it is mined at the price of a hash. And there is a conversion between QUAI or QI with an economic controller that sort of looks at that sort of backward-looking history of QUAI and QI conversions and what it means for difficulty. And then again, depending on the preference for both. So now you can imagine a scenario, if you look at sort of demand for QUAI and QI going down, well, then the hash rate will go down. So you sort of get this valve of hash rate sort of being that proxy to real-world value.
So a couple of weeks ago, Blockworks held Digital Asset Summit in New York, and Meltem Demirors gave a talk. And I feel like over the years, she's kind of become well known for being a bit of a cynic. And in her cynical talk about how we have a bunch of interlopers coming into the blockchain space and not real visionaries, the underlying message was that proof of work is the killer use case for blockchain networks. So we saw over the past 5 years this narrative that proof of work is killing the earth, proof of stake is super sexy. But I'm curious, is proof of work coming back? Is it bringing sexy back?
I think so, but not for the reasons that Meltem talked about. She was really critical of Ethereum for, again, kind of that topic I brought up earlier of the merge and why they shifted to proof of stake. And I think if you look at that shift, it's not something that actually was natively around her principles of making it, say, slower. per se, or like the shift of making Ethereum worse in any way as an asset. I think that proof of work has very different principles and different design approaches around it. And I do think from what we're doing, proof of work is coming back. We've really thought about it from a sense of why should a blockchain be proof of work? And if it is, how do you actually make it useful in that way? You shouldn't just make it proof of work because you think it's better from an ideological perspective. It's because you can make real trade-offs that make the system easier to use, or again, have a better user experience. And so the reason why we've looked at proof of work is because we've actually found it to be more scalable than proof of stake. And some of the examples of this is, again, more technical, but if you look at proof of stake, you actually have to use the bandwidth in the network for voting, and it's multi-round consensus. I have to ask you what your vote was on the block, you have to ask me what my vote was on the block, and there's a real overhead that goes across the wire whenever you make that sort of communication. In proof of work, you just use your hash rate that is completely outside of the network bandwidth, and that sort of dictates your vote. In QUAI, we've actually made that process faster as well, because we use something called POEM, or proof of entropy minima, which allows for single round consensus. So you only have to broadcast the block. You don't have to broadcast the block and then see which block is chosen based off of the next block that's built, like traditional Nakamoto consensus is done. But those types of questions, you really have to go down the rabbit hole, and you can't just say energy is the reason. You can't just say, compute is good and we want crypto to succeed. So compute and energy and all of these things are going to be the thing that helps crypto become this killer use case. We have to, again, go back to those principles of, well, what are those things that allow us to accomplish these goals? And energy is one of those things that helped us design Qi, because now, again, we have that unit of account. And proof of work is something that's actually helped us scale the blockchain more so than having it be proof of stake. And so those properties are something that we've sort of leveraged in a sense to have this proof of work renaissance. And there's a lot of other things in QUAI that are sort of renaissance-esque that we've improved, and I could talk about it all day. But I think Meltem's onto something, and from what I recall from her post, had a few objections to it. And I think that, again, it shouldn't be from the sense of being critical of Ethereum. It should be more so, if you're going to compete with Ethereum, you have to make a better system. And you can do that with or without proof of work. We've just chosen to do it with proof of work.
And so maybe this next question I have kind of ties into using POEM as opposed to Nakamoto consensus. But when you look at like Cardano can't run DeFi on the chain. It needs to use some sort of centralized sequencer because of the UTXO-based model issue. And essentially the chain just cannot operate fast enough with the UTXOs to perform DeFi operations. So maybe this is leading you into a question for how POEM like abstracts away the issues with UTXO for DeFi. How have you kind of addressed like the old school UTXO chains and implemented these changes and solutions into QUAI?
Great question. And this actually goes back to the dual token that we talked about earlier with QUAI and QI. So QUAI is actually EVM compatible. And so if you're using the QUAI token, you will use the QUAI token as gas to do EVM compatible interactions. And so with that, you can go do borrow lend, you can do DeFi, you can do NFTs, you can do gaming, you name it. And that's all great. But the problem with the EVM is it's not private. So there is no really good mechanism for using the EVM every day if you want to go and accept currency, you want to spend it, or you want to actually kind of use it as a system that can be used for payments and PayFi in the sense, right? That's the title of that report. And so from that side, we've seen people try to use that for USDC, but again, it's all public. On the UTXO side, when we look at sort of the Qi ledger being UTXO-based, it uses fixed denominations. And so it actually has these sort of almost non-fungible types of denominations that can't be broken up. So like 1s, 5s, 10s, 25s. And so it's spent like dollar bills and it's used like dollar bills. And then there's sort of the ability to do reaggregation and other nice properties that actually make Qi look like cash. So when we say Qi is the first crypto native cash, we actually mean that from both the source of stability with energy and actually spending it to make it look like cash. And so there's other nice properties in that as well. But for us, when you look at something like Cardano being proof of stake and using Ouroboros doesn't necessarily limit it in terms of its design for transactions, because I remember the meme being Uno swap whenever they had a swap on Cardano that limited it to one transaction per block if they wanted to transact the tokens there. And so that's not necessarily a proof of stake that POEM fixes. It's a matter of how do you actually get a VM to run? And I think those are two separate things. Although with POEM, if we were to say compare it to Cardano and compare it to other proof of stake systems, the really beautiful thing about POEM and having it utilize proof of work is that it breaks off that financial tie to the traditional finance system. You only need energy to go and run a node with some internet, right? Or eventually even satellite, as I talked about before. And so from that side, you don't need to go buy ADA from someone or ETH from someone, and you don't have to try to do this exchange or have it gifted to you, or in some ways, you can just go and run a node. And that's a really powerful feature of Poem.
Cool. So I guess zooming out, wrapping up, you mentioned that QUAI is EVM compatible. You also mentioned earlier that, you have to go out and talk to businesses to adopt QI. So what's the go-to-market strategy? How do you get both EVM devs and also institutions and mom and pop shops using QI?
Yeah. One of the things that we want to focus on, as I said, with QI is the viral scheme of payments and having this way of which people actually can go and force it to get adopted and help the sort of grassroots effort there. And I remember there was actually a big push back in like 2017, 2018, around that time, where you'd actually see places accept Bitcoin. There's Bitcoin ATMs, and there's all these ways that made it feel more real to use crypto. Like if you're walking into a convenience store and you see a Bitcoin ATM, well, that might be useful. And so to me, that could be one of those mechanisms that I see with QI and having that be adopted, places that have the natural incentive to go and do it and sort of help us grow the community in an organic way in which, at some point, it's going to be out of our hands to control. All of the stuff we build is open source. We're open source first, and we want that community to sort of grow virally just without so much of our control. So there are some things that we're doing. BlipPay is one of those, which is like a Venmo-like experience that's on mobile that will have means of using QUAI and QI. And then on top of that, building things like Shopify integrations and, wallet integrations into different types of dApps that will all be useful. And then, of course, helping businesses and people understand what it is. So revolving around education and having that become more commonplace.
Cool. So beyond BlipPay and kind of like education, what's next for QUAI? What's on the roadmap? What's like the killer thing coming up in the next quarter or two?
Yeah, so we are currently running a campaign. We're doing the QUAI Spring. We launched a calendar on X the other day, and it has all of these exciting announcements and updates for what QUAI is doing. So we're actually working on decentralized mining pools right now. So if you look at the proof of work space, you look at things like Stratum V2. We have a few different concepts in QUAI, one of which is called work shares. And then we're extending that to decentralized mining pools in which anyone can sort of plug in their GPU and access that, and then eventually make that a relay layer and a communication layer so anyone can plug into a pool anywhere and get work done that way. And then beyond that, we have a few other key launches around ecosystem partners and projects that have more on the way to come. Growing the ecosystem is going to be huge as well. As I shared before with that EVM, we have people tapped in and developers. So always focused on builder grants, getting people the ability to come into the ecosystem and contribute their time and their mind share. We have more stuff to do on that front. We have a unique DeFi concept called liquid mining tokens, in which miners can take their rewards under lock for additional yield in the system. And that is going to be tokenized and then become freely tradable against that future reward, which is super interesting. And then community is huge. So like X Spaces and broadcasts, podcasts like this, just getting the word out there, pounding the pavement and telling the story. The spaces become incredibly noisy. So anything for signal and cutting through there so that people can hear about what we're doing is going to be key.
Awesome. Well, I think QUAI is poised to take advantage of the broader zeitgeist in terms of focus on stablecoins and kind of like this new narrative of going back to proof of work, especially as institutions start looking more seriously and grokking with what Bitcoin is. So I love the QUAI story. I think it's going to be really exciting for people to listen to this episode. If anyone listened to this and wants to reach out to you, who do you want to speak to and what's the best way they can contact you?
Yeah, so my handle on X is OXAllenK. My DMs are always open. Glad to chat with people that have questions. The QUAI account is at Quai Network, QUAI Network on Twitter, X. Discord, I'm always available there as well. So if you jump in the QUAI Discord, I think the link is discord.gg/QUAI. And so I'm pretty active in that always. Feel free to drop me a note and I'll, always pretty available. And then outside of that, Telegram as well, we have links available. YouTube has a ton of great content on it. So Quai Network on YouTube has a ton of great resources about what we're building, AMAs, breakdowns, tutorials on how to run a node, how to run a miner, how to get your Pelagus wallet set up, how to get involved with the ecosystem. So all of those things are ways in which you can go dive into more.
Awesome. Well, Alan, thank you for sharing an hour of your time with us. It was really fun to dig into QUAI with you.
Appreciate it, Dylan. Looking forward to being back.
Cheers. Thank you so much for tuning into the Smart Economy podcast. To stay in the loop with all of our latest episodes and insights, head over to www.smarteconomypodcast.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for all our video content. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please consider showing your support by liking, commenting, and reviewing this episode on your favorite podcasting platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and brings even better content your way. We'd also love to hear from you, so please drop a comment on Spotify or YouTube to share what topics you'd like us to cover or who you'd like to see as our next guest. And if you or someone you know might make a great guest, feel free to reach out. We're always looking for fresh voices and new perspectives. And for our NEO token holders out there, please consider voting for NEO News Today as your council representative. We've proudly been serving the NEO ecosystem since 2017 and will continue to do so by putting portions of our council rewards directly back into ecosystem growth initiatives. Thank you so much again for listening to the Smart Economy podcast, and we will catch you on the next episode.